Hi, my name is Jeremiah Hansen. I'm a principal architect in the Global Field CTO office at Snowflake, and I'm really excited to walk you through my new Quickstart on data engineering with notebooks in Snowflake. So this is really exciting. With Snowflake Notebooks now, you're able to build entire end-to-end data engineering pipelines all within Snowflake. And we can schedule those notebooks with our task feature, and then we can deploy them in an automated fashion through a CI/CD pipeline, leveraging our Snowflake CLI and other DevOps tools. So this is going to be a great resource and show you how to get started with notebook data engineering. All right, well, let's jump into it. So here is the quick start, getting started with data engineering using Snowflake Notebooks. And let me start by just walking through what we're going to build in this demo in quick start. So if we look at the diagram here, let's zoom in. We're going to build a few pipelines. We're going to start by ingesting data that we have in S3, in Excel files, into some tables in Snowflake. And we're going to do that with a notebook. Then we're going to take some weather data from the Snowflake marketplace, join it with our Excel data, and create a final daily city metrics aggregated table, again, using a Snowflake notebook. So each of these pipelines will be represented by a notebook in Snowflake. And this really is generally a best practice to have one notebook per target table. So even as I say that, you can see that I'm violating that principle here by creating two tables with the same notebook to make it easier for the demo. But in practice, the idea is to have that a notebook represents a pipeline that produces a target table. Then what we're going to do is take those notebooks, those pipelines, and schedule them with tasks. And I'll show how to deploy those with our new Task DAG API. And then finally, we're going to make a change and actually deploy that from dev to production using GitHub Actions. So really exciting. By the end of this, you should have everything, all the building blocks you need to build complete end-to-end pipelines, to schedule them and to deploy them. All right, so I've gone through already and run through the setup steps. So I've gone through and forked the repository and done all of that. If you click on the link here to actually look at the repository, this is the forked version of it. Let me just walk through a couple of the overview of the files. So we have here in GitHub, this repository, two different notebooks. So those notebooks that I showed before, back here on the overview, 6 and 7, they show up here as with a folder for each, 6 and 7. And each notebook has an IPYNB file and an environment YAML file that defines which packages it uses. So I've got those in here. I've also got some scripts to help with deploying notebooks and some other stuff. So that's our repository. I've already, like I said, gone through and I've done the quick start setup. And then the setup bit, what we do is we actually load the 0.0 notebook. So if I go back here, in the repository, there's a notebook, 0.0 start here. And I've got that loaded and already pulled up here. Part of the first bit of setup is going through and changing some of these values for GitHub to your own account. And I did that already and ran it. And this then creates, if I go through and quickly show you, we create a demo database and role and warehouse. And then down here, we actually created a stage that connects to S3 with those Excel files. And here's where we actually create the GitHub integration. So I'm creating an integration in a Git repository to my GitHub repository here that I forked. And then I'm also creating an event table. So all of that I've done, and now we'll pick up at that point. So just to start with, let me show you. In the Snowset UI, I have this demo database. This is what we just created. And just to refresh, you can see there's no funny business. There's nothing here in the dev schema and nothing in the prod schema. We'll be building that out. Under integrations, this is those items I mentioned, the stage. And in particular, let's look at the Git repository. So I'm able to, with Snowsight now, browse my Git repository through the UI. So just like I showed you in GitHub, I can do the same here. I can click in on the folders and browse in and look at the structure of my Git repository. And I can also switch branches and do that work here. So this is one of the nice new features built in around Git integration. All right, so let's go back. And actually, the first step we're gonna do, we have the empty databases. We're gonna deploy the dev version of our notebooks. So to do that, I'm gonna run this command here, which is execute immediate from. This is one of the new DevOps features that Snowflake provides. And what it does is actually lets you run a SQL script that either lives in a stage or that lives in your Git repository. And you can see that here, I'm actually pulling it from the main branch, and this script is called deploy notebooks. And let me just, it just finished, but let me go back and show you what that looks like. So if we go into our scripts folder and we look at the deploy notebooks SQL, it's a very basic script. It creates 2 notebooks, and you can see that with the create or replace notebook identifier. And let me just zoom in here once, make this a little bigger for everybody. So you can see create or replace notebook, and then it does an alter notebook. And you can see here these parameterized, these curly braces. This is Jinja. And our execute immediate from command allows you to specify templates with Jinja. In this case, I'm passing in you can see env for the environment and branch for the branch. So if I go back here to the notebook, you'll see that I passed those here with this using clause. So I'm executing that script and passing parameters. And this is already completed. If I go now, I'm going to keep one tab with that notebook open. I'm going to come back over here. Notebooks are available under projects. So if I click on projects and then notebooks, you'll be able to see the various notebooks that I have. And I've deployed these 2 notebooks now, the 6 and 7. And you can see that they're prefixed with dev. And when I do the production version, they'll have a prod version in there. And this is just this is for this demo, really an easy way to, this Quickstart, an easy way to see this. In the real world, you would have this might be in different Snowflake accounts or different databases. And so this wouldn't all show up in the same database, but for this Quickstart, to keep it simple, we're gonna do that. So let's open up one of the notebooks, the Dev 6. And if you remember, let's go back here and I'll keep this up on this page. If you remember, this is the notebook where we're going to load data from the Excel files into these 2 tables, location and order detail. So let's start the notebook up. And I'll call a couple things out while this is starting. So on the left, you'll notice that this is connected to my Git repository. So you'll see that it's part of my dev branch, and you can see the files, those 2 files I showed you before that make it up. We can actually click on the environment YAML to see we have a dependency here on OpenPyXL, but I'm able to now see my Git integration, and I can pull changes to it here. And then we'll come back to the commit in a second. This started up really quick. I don't know if you noticed. It was before I even really got to talking about the Git integration. And this is one of the really important benefits here of Snowflake Notebooks is it leverages our existing warehouse. And so these start up very quick, on the order of 5 to 10 seconds to start a notebook, because it's starting a process on that existing warehouse. So this is just an incredible benefit compared to Spark and spending 5 minutes for a cluster to start. These run on our existing warehouses, which start up really for most size warehouses instantly. So I got my notebook running, and I'm just going to go through and run. I'm going to run all the commands in here, and I'll just talk through them. So the first thing I'm doing is just selecting the current database and schema for some context. And then in this import section, I'm going through, and I'm actually referencing, you can see here where I'm saying cells.sql get context. It's actually accessing this result here. And I can pull out the database and schema name from that. So this could be a query against a table. In this case, it's just a very simple query to get some context. I'm also defining a logger. I'll come back to this in the next notebook. But I'm actually then throughout going to be logging informational messages. And this is a great way to instrument your code as well. And then I'm getting my active session, which is going to be configured for me with my credentials. So all of that gets set up. I'm selecting a couple. Again, this is just a hard-coded select query. This could pull from a table. But I'm passing in those 2 Excel files, the path to them, and then where I want the target to land. Scrolling down a little further, I've got now a Python function which is going to read those Excel files and write them to Snowflake. And right now this is using the data frame API to write that to a target table, and it's using the OpenPyXL library to actually read those Python files. This also provides you a really great pattern to follow to load any type of file that you have. Ones that Snowflake doesn't support natively, like JSON or XML or CSV, Parquet, Avro, those, the standard formats we support, you can use a pattern like this to load them yourself. Any library in Python that can help can do that. So pretty powerful. And then I'm just looping through each of those result sets again from another cell, those 2 rows, and loading the data into tables. And that's completed now. So if I, over here on the left, I can switch between the files in the database. I'll come in here to the demo database. Let me just refresh it. And remember, before we had no objects here in the dev, and now we've got 2, location and or detail. So we were able to load that data into the tables in Snowflake. So that's our first notebook. Now let's go to the second one. And again, I'm gonna start this up here. So the second notebook, if we go back to the diagram, is gonna now take data from a weather share and load it into Snowflake. So before I can run this, I actually need to map the weather data. So I always say that my favorite kind of data engineering pipeline is one you don't have to create and maintain. And that's the power, that shows the power and beauty of our marketplace in Snowflake. So let me actually go back out here first. If I go to the marketplace and I want to get some weather data, so I can come out, search through the marketplace, find data sets that exist. And in this case, our friends at WeatherSource have created a data set here that's just for our, so Frostbite's our demo environment. And I can actually come in, I'm gonna give it a certain name, the database that gets mapped, and assign it to this role. And all I have to do is specify a few parameters and click get. And at this point, now I have this data available to me. It shows up as a database in Snowflake, and I don't have to, you can see that here with Frostbite WeatherSource, and I don't have to do anything to refresh it. As soon as the provider updates it, it's available to me instantly. And this is really the power of data sharing with Snowflake. So now I have that, let me go back to my notebooks and start it up again. So now we have the data mapped, and we have our Excel data loaded, weather data, and now we can create this daily city metrics table. So that's what we're gonna do in the second notebook. So again, I'm gonna run every cell in here, and then I'll talk through. The first couple cells are the same as before. We've got some context set, get our session. Now I wanna introduce another neat feature with Snowflake, is our new Snowflake Python Management API. This lets you interact with objects in Snowflake programmatically with Python objects. So here you can see, traditionally we might have done something like this, where we're using session.sql and using just a SQL command. But with the new Python API, I can do everything in Python. So I'm actually going in and finding if a table exists by searching for that in Python. And this is a simple example. The Management API also allows you to have the ability to create objects as well. And so you can do all of that through Python. And when we get to the Task DAG API in a minute, I'll show you how powerful that is as well. But so I'm using that all in Python. And then I have a really simple data frame expression here. So this is showing the Snowpark data frame API, which again is, if you're not familiar, is very similar to the PySpark data frame API. And so you can take that existing code, migrate it with very few changes, and have it run in Snowflake. And Snowflake runs this code much faster and cheaper than Spark, because it actually leverages the Snowflake query engine, our vectorized query engine, to run these queries, as opposed to running them in Spark. But you can see I'm basically joining a few data frames together, aggregating it, and then down below here, if the table doesn't exist, I'm creating a new one. And if it does, then I'm actually also running a merge command. So this is a powerful pattern showing how to do an upsert operation. So this pipeline would process data incrementally in Snowflake. So I've got that, and then that's the end of that particular notebook. So this, again, builds that one table. If I go back here now and refresh again, you'll see we should have 3 tables. Hit refresh. The daily city metrics. So now we've got all 3 of our tables, and you've seen the pipelines. I want to briefly talk about the logging. So I showed you earlier that we have these log messages. When I set that up back here on the overview page, we created an event table. So I created an event table in my demo database, and then I set that as the default for the account, and I set the log level to info. And now I'm able to log those messages. And I can get at those a number of ways. So here, if we go down to step 7, you can see I can query this in SQL. So I'm able to query this log message. You can see here's my log messages. So for notebook 6, it did a start and an end. You can see I processed these 2 files, and then 7 started and ended. So these are my particular log messages, but one of the really cool things is we're instrumenting all of our features, all of our capabilities in Snowflake with the same capability. So when you run a notebook just out of the box, it's instrumenting itself. So you can see all of these messages are coming from the notebook whenever a cell is run. And this is going to be true going forward for all of our services. So very powerful way to track this. And we're also going to have the capability within Snowsight to have a visual log viewer as well. So really powerful capability there. All right, the next step we want to do, we've loaded data. Now we want to orchestrate that data. So I'm going to show you now how to do that. I mentioned earlier our Python management API when we just tested to see if a table exists. What we're going to do now is actually create a task DAG all within Python. And if you're not familiar, a DAG stands for Directed Acyclic Graph. And this really is a common pattern for representing dependencies among objects for scheduling and other uses. So what I'm going to do is go through and run these cells. So we're going to load the Python management API and just set some basic context here. And then here's the code. Really simple. If you've used Airflow before, this is actually very similar to the Airflow v1 Python API. So I'm defining 2 tasks, load Excel files and load daily city metrics. Each task, the definition is very similar. It's execute notebook and then the notebook name. So we're able to actually schedule those notebooks with a simple SQL command, execute notebook, and we use that, and we do tasks then to schedule that. And then I define the dependencies between the 2 DAGs, and I deployed it. So this is a powerful way to manage complex relationships and complex deployments of tasks within Snowflake. And again, all in Python. So I actually now have this deployed. So let's flip back over and I'll show you a couple of things around tasks. So in our demo database, if I refresh, we now have some tasks as well. And I've deployed these. The Snowflake UI gives you a really nice way to view this. So I'm starting with this demo DAG task, and I can look at a graph now of it. And you can see here, when I deployed it through this Python API, it created this root node called demo DAG. And then each of those tasks that I specified were basically dependent on that. So it creates this initial one. That's important so that we can have 2 tasks initially, which they all have to have a single parent. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And I'll show you. So you can run that right through here through the UI. This would also run on a schedule. But I also can see in the UI here now a run history. So I can see for all the runs of this particular task, where it failed, where it succeeded. That one, the first one, since it's sort of a dummy task, completed very quickly. The second one completed. And the third one now is actually finishing, and it'll probably be done here shortly. So just finished. So I'm able to run all those, and there's really no changes since I already did it once in dev, but that shows you the task, the overall kind of task flow. All right, next, we're going to do something really neat. We're going to actually deploy. Let's go back to our diagram. Now we're actually going to make a change and deploy this all through a GitHub Actions pipeline. And we're going to not only deploy a change, but we're going to deploy the production version of these. So to do that, let's go back to our notebooks and let's open up, let's just, in either notebook, doesn't matter. I'm going to make a really simple change, and the change doesn't matter here. I'm just going to uncomment this line at the end. So I've made simple change. You can see now already, as soon as I made that change, over in the left here, it's showing that this file's been modified. And this is showing our Git integration in Snowsight with notebooks. So I'm able to, now I can commit this change to my repo. So I'm going to call this just demo. For the token, I'm going to copy my GitHub personal access token. And I can now commit this change to my dev branch in my repository. So this is really neat. The integration with Git supports writing notebooks into your Git repository. All right, so now I've got that committed to my Git repository. Now let's go through and actually deploy that. So in order to actually do the deployment, this would now follow your CI/CD DevOps process, whatever that might be, whichever tool you're using, you can pick up from here. So we'll do this with GitHub. Let's go back out to our repository. And I've now pushed a change into my dev branch. So you can see it tells me here that my dev branch had a recent change. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to flip here to the dev branch. And you'll see the same thing here, that it's been changed. And I'm going to open a pull request here. Now, one thing that's important if you're going through this, by default, GitHub will, when you're doing a pull request, will compare this forked branch, this forked repository, back to the official Snowflake Labs repository that I cloned earlier. But I don't want to push the change back there. I actually want to push it to the main branch in my forked repository. So I need to change this here to point to from Snowflake Labs to my repository. And when I do that, you'll see it simplifies it, and now it shows I'm merging from dev to main. I'm going to scroll down. You can see the one change I made, which is just to add this or to remove that comment. And now at this point, I can create this pull request. So with the pull request created, and again, this is showing a really simple example, but in the real world, this would be part of a larger process. And you would obviously be making more important changes. So I'm going to confirm, and I'm going to merge this into my main branch. So assume it all went through the process, everybody reviewed it, signed off, it looks good. Now what I'm going to do is show you, we have actually a GitHub action defined, which is going to kick off this automated CI/CD pipeline. And just to show briefly what that does, let's go back to the code here. And again, this is a simple repository or simple workflow. You can do this any CI/CD tool that you like. This is showing GitHub Actions. To translate this YAML into a different CI/CD tool is very straightforward. But what this does really simply is it goes through, it checks out the repository, sets up Python, installs some requirements like our Snow CLI tool. And then here's the command. It's actually running this deploy notebook step. I'm taking environment variables that I set up during the Quickstart setup or secrets and creating those as environment variables. And then I'm running two commands here, and this is the Snow CLI tool. So where you see the command Snow, this is actually our Snowflake CLI tool. And this is going forward our developer tool that we're building all of these capabilities into. And this would be the primary tool you would use in a CI/CD pipeline. So if you're familiar, we also have a SnowSQL command, which is SnowSQL. That's been around for a long time in Snowflake. That lets you run interactively SQL commands against Snowflake and run SQL scripts against Snowflake. So we still have that. Long term, we're going to converge on this Snowflake CLI tool, and we'll merge all those capabilities here. But right now what I'm doing is running two SQL commands and I'm going to alter my Git repository and fetch new changes. And then I'm going to run this execute immediate command again. If you notice, this is essentially the same command I ran earlier in the notebook, except for now the difference is I'm using production versions for those Jinja variables, if you remember. So I'm using prod here for the environment and the main for the branch. Let's go back and look. This should have completed successfully, and it did. And we can come in and look at the output, which is basically what we saw earlier in the notebook, but we're able to now, we've created those notebooks in production. So if I go back out now to, let's go back out here and let's go back to my notebooks. If I refresh here, we should expect to see prod versions of the notebooks, and we do. So we've now actually, through an automated CI/CD pipeline, deployed the production version of those. And just for the sake of this demo, I'll go through here now and let's go back to the orchestrating pipelines here. Just deploy the dev or the prod version of these tasks, the task DAG. So I'm just going to comment this line and uncomment this. So all I've changed is the schema to be prod schema, and then what this will do is now deploy to my production bit, but the same code here. Okay, so now I've got the production tasks deployed. And this of course could be put into a script and automated. I actually do have in the scripts folder, I'll show you that. Under scripts, I do have another script which we're not using right now, but it's the deploy task DAG. And this actually has the same code from the notebook, but this would allow you then to put this into a CI/CD pipeline as well and automate it. But for now, let's go back. If we look at the data again, you can see that now in my production schema, I should have the tasks deployed. And I can run these again through this task graph viewer. So I'll kick it off here. And this should just take a second to run. You saw last time how fast it was. And let's go through and look. This first notebook is what loads the Excel files. So it's running. And when I'm done with this, we'll have those same 3 tables in our production schema. So pretty powerful. Right now, it looks like we have 2 of them. So we can refresh, and actually it's all finished. So they're all 3 here. So very cool. I've deployed now into production through an automated pipeline. My notebooks, they're scheduled and running. All right, so let's go back here and just recap here at the end. So we did all of these steps. We were able to ingest data from Excel with Python. We were able to access data through a share, which is the best kind of data engineering pipeline because you don't have to create it or maintain it yourself. We created 2 notebooks to manage the pipelines to create those tables. We scheduled them with tasks using the Python Task DAG API. We instrumented all of our code with logging. And then we ended up making a change and deploying the pipeline through a GitHub Actions workflow into production. So very cool. Hopefully this is a helpful resource to you as you get started with notebook data engineering. All right, well, that wraps it up. How cool was that? We're able to build entire end-to-end pipelines in Snowflake with notebooks. We can schedule them with tasks and then deploy them in an automated fashion. So hopefully you're as excited as I am, and hopefully you have the building blocks now to start building your own pipelines in Snowflake. All right, thanks a lot. Bye.